She, a perfectionist conductor, felt her music lacked soul. He, a chaotic sound technician, heard music in everything. Their first meeting is a disaster, but he overhears her struggling with a lifeless composition and asks, "You're playing the notes, but you're not telling the story. What's the story behind the music?" This question breaks down Eleanor Vance's defenses. Jules helps her find the emotion behind the notes. Get ready for a twist where the board will try to push him away, but passion and love will prove that true harmony lies in the balance between chaos and precision. Watch this story until the end. You will be amazed by this story. If you like stories of love, romance, subscribe to this channel, leave your comment. Every day we post videos like this. Continuing. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of the Grand Majestic Theater in Chicago, creating golden shafts of light that danced across the empty rows of plush velvet seats. Eleanor Vance adjusted her reading glasses and observed every detail of the environment with the meticulous gaze of someone who knows every inch of that sacred space. Her hands, delicate but firm, leafed through the Brahms score resting on the conductor's stand, checking for the third time that all the annotations were perfectly aligned. At 32, Eleanor had earned the respect of the entire American artistic community. The daughter of German immigrants who settled in Wisconsin decades ago, she grew up in an environment where discipline and excellence were not optional, but basic requirements of existence. Her father, a meticulous watchmaker, and her mother, a piano teacher, molded in her a personality that found beauty in precision and peace in absolute control. As artistic director of the Chicago Philharmonic Orchestra, Eleanor had transformed a respectable musical ensemble into one of the most prestigious orchestras in the country. Each rehearsal was conducted with the precision of a surgeon, each note executed with the perfection of a Swiss watch. Experienced musicians whispered among themselves that working under her baton was like participating in a dance choreographed by the music gods themselves. On that Thursday afternoon, however, something disturbed the usual harmony of her world. The gala performance next week would be the most important of her career. A benefit night that would bring together the cultural and business elite of the entire Midwest. The program included works by classic American composers interspersed with her own original composition, a violin concerto that she had been perfecting for 2 years. Eleanor walked across the empty stage, her low-heeled shoes echoing in the solemn silence of the theater. She stopped in front of the Steinway grand piano, opened the lid, and played a few notes of her composition. The sound emerged crystal clear, technically impeccable, each chord constructed with mathematical precision. But as her hands danced across the keys, a knot formed in her stomach. The music was perfect, absolutely perfect, and that's exactly what tormented her. In recent months, Eleanor had begun to question something she had never dared to question before: her own art. The reviews were always glowing, speaking of her impeccable technique and precise interpretation. But recently, while reading a particularly enthusiastic review of her last performance, a phrase had struck her like a lightning bolt. Maestro Vance performs each piece with the perfection of a human metronome. Human metronome. The words echoed in her mind every time she held the baton. Eleanor slammed the piano lid shut harder than she intended, the sound reverberating through the empty theater. She checked her watch. 5 o'clock in the afternoon. There was still time for one last rehearsal with the concertmaster before heading home to her organized apartment in Lincoln Park, where dining alone while reviewing scores had become her routine for years. Her personal life was a reflection of her professional life, controlled, planned, devoid of surprises. She woke up every day at 6 in the morning, drank skim milk latte and whole wheat toast, read the cultural sections of the New York Times while mentally planning the day's rehearsals. Her weekends were dedicated to studying new compositions or visiting her mother, who at 75 still played the piano with the same iron discipline she had passed on to her daughter. Romantic relationships were something that Eleanor had systematically avoided. Not for lack of interest, but because she had never found someone who understood the total dedication that her art required. The few men who tried to get close soon gave up in the face of her inflexible schedules and her need for silence, for concentration. "You live for the music," said the last suitor 3 years ago. "There's no room for anything else in your life." He wasn't completely wrong. But what he didn't understand was that music had become both her passion and her prison. Eleanor knew that something was changing inside her, a growing restlessness that she could neither name nor control. As much as she tried to maintain the rigorous routine, as much as she focused on the search for perfect execution, there was a void expanding in her chest. It was as if all the discipline and control that had taken her to the top of her profession were now suffocating her. She looked once more at the empty stage, imagining what it would be like next week. Bright lights, elegant audience, every note of her original composition echoing through the theater. It should be the pinnacle of her career, the confirmation of everything she had worked for. But instead of anticipation, she felt only an inexplicable melancholy, as if she were preparing to carry out her own life sentence in perfection. She put the score in her Italian leather briefcase, straightened the erect posture she had maintained since childhood, and walked towards the exit. Tomorrow would be another day of rigorous rehearsals, of searching for impeccable execution, of trying to find the soul in a music that seemed to have lost the ability to breathe. Outside the theater, the life of Chicago followed its chaotic and unpredictable rhythm, but Eleanor walked through it as if she were in a bubble of silence, protected and isolated from the real world by an invisible armor of discipline and control that, for the first time in her life, began to weigh more than it protected. Monday arrived with a light rain drumming on the roof of the grand, majestic theater, creating an irregular symphony that made Eleanor frown. She hated unscheduled noises during rehearsals, especially when preparing for such an important performance. She arrived at the theater an hour early, as always, to make sure everything was in perfect order before the musicians arrived. But nothing was in order. The theater's sound system, which dated back to the 80s, had suffered a catastrophic failure over the weekend. The speakers emitted a constant hiss, and the recording equipment simply refused to work. For a woman who had planned every detail of the next 5 days with military precision, this was a disaster. "We got a technician last minute," explained Robert Silver, the theater manager, as he followed her through the corridors. "He's not exactly what we expected, but he's the only one available on such short notice. He has a good reputation, well, you'll see." Eleanor didn't like the hesitant tone in Robert's voice. She needed a competent professional, someone who understood the critical importance of the event, not someone who came with caveats. As they approached the main stage, a jarring electric guitar riff echoed through the theater. Eleanor stopped abruptly, her eyes widening in shock. Someone was playing progressive rock in her musical sanctuary, turning the sacred space into something more like an underground club. "That's our technician," Robert muttered, clearly uncomfortable. On stage, surrounded by an organized mess of cables, amplifiers, and electronic equipment that Eleanor could barely identify, stood a man of about 30. His dark brown hair fell untidily over his shoulders, and he wore a faded t-shirt of a band she had never heard of. Enormous headphones covered his ears as he tested connections, completely oblivious to the presence of the two. Jules Moretti was in his element. For him, every technical problem was a musical puzzle waiting to be solved. He didn't follow manuals or rigid protocols. He relied on his keen ears and a technical intuition developed over years working in studios, bars, and nightclubs all over the States. He had grown up on the streets of Brooklyn, the son of a single mother who cleaned offices at night to support the family. Music was his salvation and his school, teaching him that sometimes the best solutions came from improvisation, not theory. "Excuse me!" Eleanor shouted, her voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. Jules didn't hear. He was focused on adjusting the equalization, moving sliders with the precision of a maestro, conducting an invisible orchestra. For him, sound was something alive, something that needed to be felt and shaped, not just technically configured. Eleanor walked onto the stage with determined steps, her heels echoing like gunshots on the wooden floor. When she got close enough, she firmly touched the technician's shoulder. Jules turned around, taking one of the headphones off. His eyes met hers, and for a moment time seemed suspended. He saw a woman of classic beauty, with blonde hair pulled back in an impeccable bun, and blue eyes that shone with an intensity that caught him off guard. She saw a man whose face reflected the same passion for music that she felt, but expressed in a completely different way. "You need to stop that immediately," Eleanor said, gesturing to the equipment. "This is a classical theater, not a rock studio." Jules grinned, a smile that mixed genuine amusement with a touch of defiance. "Relax, maestro. I'm just testing the acoustic response of the room. This place has incredible reverb, but the highs are a little muffled in the center." "Maestro?" Eleanor repeated, her voice rising an octave. "I am the artistic director of this orchestra, and I need you to understand that we have a very specific schedule to follow." "Got it perfectly," Jules replied, putting the headphone back on his ear. "And that's exactly why I'm working now. You want everything to work perfectly at your performance, right? So let me do my job." Eleanor was speechless. No one had challenged her like that in years, especially not someone wearing a ripped t-shirt and beat-up sneakers. But there was something about his quiet confidence, about the way he talked about acoustics with genuine knowledge, that intrigued her against her will. "How much time do you need?" she asked, trying to regain control of the situation. "Depends," Jules replied, already turning his attention back to the equipment. "If you stand here supervising me and commenting on every move, it'll take all day. If you let me work in peace, 2 hours max." His audacity was both irritating and strangely refreshing. Eleanor was used to professionals who bowed to her authority, who asked permission before touching anything. Jules seemed to operate in a completely different universe, where hierarchy mattered less than the final result. "Very well," she said, taking a few steps back, "but I want you to know that the first rehearsal starts at 9 o'clock sharp. Not 9:05, not 9:02. 9. "You got it, boss," Jules replied without looking at her, already immersed back in his work. Eleanor stepped off the stage with the strange feeling that something fundamental had changed in her perfectly ordered world. For the first time in years, someone had entered her space without asking permission, had questioned her authority without showing fear or reverence. And more disturbing still, part of her had enjoyed the experience. As she headed to her office, she could still hear the experimental sounds that Jules produced, testing different settings and adjustments. It was chaotic and unpredictable, everything she normally detested. But there was a musical logic behind that apparent disorder, a method in the madness that her trained mind was beginning to recognize. She sat down at her desk and tried to concentrate on the final revision of the score, but her thoughts kept returning to the technician on stage. There was something about him that had awakened a curiosity that she had long thought she had lost, a willingness to understand how someone could be so different from her and yet share the same fundamental passion for music. From the stage came now softer sounds, an improvised melody that Jules played as he worked. It was simple, unpretentious, but carried a raw emotionality that made Eleanor stop writing and just listen. For the first time in months, she found herself listening to music not to analyze or criticize, but simply to feel. During the next 3 days, Eleanor found herself doing something she never thought possible, adapting her rigid routine to accommodate the organized chaos of Jules Moretti. The technician had kept his promise, delivering an impeccable sound system in exactly 2 hours, but his presence in the theater extended beyond the initial work. There were small adjustments to be made, calibrations that depended on the presence of the full orchestra, tests that could only be performed with a full house. To her own surprise, Eleanor not only allowed him to stay, but began to find excuses to interact with him. On Tuesday morning, she arrived at the theater carrying 2 cups of coffee. It was a gesture completely out of character, but she justified it to herself as a professional courtesy. Jules was kneeling behind the stage, adjusting cables with the precision of a surgeon, but without the tension that usually accompanied technical work in her environment. "I thought you might want some coffee," she said, holding out one of the cups. Jules looked up, genuinely surprised. "Thanks, that's unexpected." He accepted the cup and took a sip. "Strong, just how I like it." "You strike me as someone who drinks strong coffee," Eleanor replied, and immediately wondered where that comment had come from. She never made personal observations about employees. "And you strike me as someone who drinks herbal tea," he retorted with a teasing smile. "Actually, I drink coffee stronger than that," she said, surprising them both with the almost playful tone in her voice. It was the beginning of a verbal dance that would repeat itself over the following days. During rehearsal breaks, Eleanor found herself walking over to where Jules was working, initially with professional excuses, checking the schedule, discussing technical adjustments, confirming details. But gradually, these conversations evolved into something more personal. "Where are you from?" she asked on Wednesday, as she watched Jules test microphones. "Brooklyn, East Side. You?" "Right here in Chicago. German family." She paused, realizing how formal her answer sounded. "My parents immigrated in the 70s. "That explains the Prussian discipline," Jules commented, but without malice. "My mom's from Miami. She always said I inherited the rhythm from the South and the stubbornness from New York." Eleanor laughed, a genuine sound that surprised her. "Stubbornness. I hadn't noticed." The irony in her voice made him stop what he was doing and look at her directly. "You have a sense of humor under all that seriousness." "Do I?" The question came out before she could censor herself. "Definitely. You just need to let it out to breathe once in a while." These little conversations began to affect Eleanor in ways she didn't expect. For the first time in years, she found herself anticipating something beyond the technical perfection of her rehearsals. She began to arrive at the theater a few minutes early, hoping to find Jules already working. She discovered that she liked the relaxed way he talked about music, as if it were something alive and organic, not an exact science. On Thursday, during the afternoon rehearsal, the moment occurred that would definitively change the dynamic between them. The orchestra was performing the opening of a piece by Copland when Eleanor realized that something was wrong with the sound. It wasn't technically incorrect, but it lacked depth, the richness that she knew the music should have. She interrupted the rehearsal and stepped down from the podium, heading directly to Jules, who was watching from the side of the stage. "The sound is flat," she said, trying to find the right words. "Technically perfect, but lifeless." Jules tilted his head, listening carefully. "You want me to adjust the bass?" "It's not just that." Eleanor hesitated, entering uncharted territory. "It's like the music is being suffocated, like it can't breathe." The comparison touched something in Jules. That's exactly how he felt about music, as a living being that needed space to grow. "Can I try something? It's kind of unorthodox." Eleanor looked at the musicians, who were waiting patiently, then at Jules. For the first time in her career, she decided to trust methods she didn't fully understand. "Let's try it." Jules asked the musicians to play the same passage again, but this time he made small adjustments in real time, not just to the technical equipment, but by asking for subtle changes in positioning, suggesting that some instruments play softer while others stood out. It was as if he were painting with sound, creating layers and textures that Eleanor had never considered. The result was revealing. The same music that had sounded correct but lifeless gained a completely new dimension. There was breath in the silences, emotion in the dynamics, a narrative that flowed naturally instead of being forced. "How did you do that?" asked Eleanor, genuinely impressed. "Music isn't just about playing the right notes," Jules replied, putting away his equipment. "It's about telling a story, and stories need space to unfold." That night, Eleanor remained in the theater long after everyone had gone home. She sat at the piano and played her own composition, the original piece that would be the highlight of the gala performance. She applied some of the ideas she had observed Jules implement, small pauses that allowed the emotion to breathe, more organic dynamics that followed the natural flow of the melody instead of rigid rules. To her surprise, the music sounded different, still technically perfect, but now with something that had been absent for so long that she had almost forgotten its existence. Soul. When she finally closed the piano and prepared to leave, she found a note left on her score. It was from Jules. "Your composition is beautiful. You just need to trust it enough to let it fly." Eleanor put the note in her briefcase, along with the scores. For the first time in months, she was looking forward to the next day's rehearsal, not just to correct technical imperfections, but to explore possibilities she didn't even know existed. The perfectly controlled world she had built was beginning to show cracks, and surprisingly, she wasn't trying to fix them. She was curious to see what might grow through them. Friday dawned with a phone call that would change everything. Eleanor was in her apartment, preparing for what would be the last rehearsal before the gala performance, when her phone rang at 7 in the morning. On the other end of the line, Robert Silver's tense voice carried devastating news. "Eleanor, we need to talk urgently. The board of directors has been meeting at the theater since 6 in the morning." Her heart leapt. The Philharmonic's board of directors never met without prior notice, especially not on the eve of such an important performance. "What happened?" "It's about the sound technician. Some concerns have been brought to our attention." Eleanor arrived at the theater 20 minutes later, finding a heavy atmosphere that contrasted drastically with the optimism of the last few days. In the meeting room, 5 men in suits awaited her, their expressions as grave as judges in a courtroom. At the head of them was Arthur Sterling, chairman of the board and one of the most influential patrons of the arts in Illinois. "Eleanor, have a seat," Sterling said without the usual cordial greetings. "We have a delicate situation." She sat down, trying to maintain her composure, but sensing that her newfound openness to change was about to be brutally tested. "We've received information about the technician you hired," Sterling continued. "Jules Moretti has a past, a checkered one." "Checkered how?" Eleanor asked, her voice maintaining a professional tone despite the growing tension. Edward Finch, the board's treasurer, opened a folder and began to read. 2 police records for disturbing the peace during performances in bars, an outstanding debt with the IRS, and more concerning, he was fired from his last full-time job at a recording studio for insubordination. "Furthermore," added Sterling, "we have reports that he has been unduly familiar with you. Theatre staff have commented on prolonged conversations, unprofessional behavior." Eleanor felt the blood rush to her face. "Unprofessional behavior? He did an exceptional job. The sound system has never worked so well." "We are not questioning his technical skills," interjected Dr. Caldwell, one of the board's more conservative members. "But our concern is our reputation. Tomorrow night's performance will bring together the cultural and business elite of the Midwest. We cannot afford to associate our orchestra with someone with that kind of history." "What kind of history?" Eleanor retorted, feeling a growing indignation. "A musician who works in bars, someone who's had financial difficulties? That doesn't define his professional competence." The awkward silence that followed was broken by Sterling. "Eleanor, we appreciate your loyalty to your staff, but you need to understand that you're not just a conductor. You're the face of this institution. Your associations reflect on all of us." "Associations?" she repeated, the word coming out like a dangerous question. "We know you've been spending considerable time together," said Finch, consulting his notes. "Conversations that extend beyond what's necessary, shared coffee, meetings after hours. To outside observers, it might seem inappropriate." The reality of what was happening hit Eleanor like a physical blow. They weren't just questioning Jules's professional competence. They were insinuating something about the nature of her interaction with him. And more painful still, they were doing it the day before the most important performance of her career. "What exactly are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice low but charged with controlled fury. "We're not suggesting anything," Sterling replied carefully. "We're just observing that your reputation, built over years of impeccable conduct, should not be compromised by questionable associations." "He will be dismissed today," declared Dr. Caldwell. "We've already secured a replacement technician. Someone with appropriate credentials and impeccable references." "The day before the performance?" Eleanor stood up abruptly. "Have you completely lost your minds? He knows every detail of the system, every adjustment needed. Bringing in someone new now is artistic suicide." "We've made our decision," said Sterling with finality. "The decision is not open to discussion." Eleanor looked at the 5 men and saw in them everything she had unconsciously fought against her whole life. The need to maintain appearances, to sacrifice substance for image, to choose pre-approved safety over actual excellence. They were men who funded art, but didn't truly understand it. "What if I refuse?" she asked. The silence was eloquent. Finally, Sterling replied, "Eleanor, you're an excellent conductor, but conductors can be replaced. The institution's reputation cannot." The implicit threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Years of work, of building her reputation, of absolute dedication to the orchestra, all being used as a weapon against her. She left the meeting in a state of shock, walking through the corridors of the theater like a sleepwalker. She found Jules on stage, making his final adjustments, completely oblivious to the storm that was breaking over him. "Good morning, maestro," he said with his familiar smile. "All set for the big day?" Eleanor watched him, his skilled hands working on the equipment, the dedicated concentration on his face, the genuine passion that shone through everything he did. In just a few days, he had awakened in her something she thought she had lost forever, the reminder of why she had fallen in love with music. And now, she had to destroy it. "Jules, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. He stopped what he was doing, immediately noticing the change in her tone. "What's wrong?" "The board has decided that your services are no longer required." His expression changed slowly, shifting from confusion to painful understanding. "I get it. Let me guess. I'm not suitable for the refined environment of the Philharmonic." Eleanor wanted to explain, to defend herself, to say that it hadn't been her decision. But the words caught in her throat, because deep down she knew that there was a choice to be made. Challenge the board and risk everything for what she had discovered with Jules, or maintain the safe and controlled world she had built over years. And in that terrible moment, surrounded by the weight of expectations and responsibilities, she chose safety. "I'm sorry," was all she could say. Jules looked at her for a long moment, and she saw in him not just disappointment, but something worse. Understanding. He understood exactly what had happened and why she had made that choice. "Of course you are," he said softly, beginning to disconnect his equipment. "Good luck tomorrow night, maestro. I hope your performance is technically perfect." The way he said technically perfect cut deeper than any shout or accusation could have done. The hours that followed Jules's dismissal were the most difficult of Eleanor's career. The replacement technician, Paul Henderson, arrived at the theater with a folder of impressive credentials and an attitude that immediately grated on her nerves. He spoke about acoustics as if it were a technical manual, adjusted equipment following rigid protocols, and treated every question she had with the exaggerated deference of someone who knew her reputation, but not her personality. During the afternoon rehearsal, Eleanor realized that something was fundamentally wrong. The sound was technically correct, each frequency adjusted according to standard specifications, but it had completely lost the life that Jules had managed to breathe into the music. It was as if someone had drained the color from a painting, leaving only a black and white sketch. "It's perfect, Maestro Vance," declared Paul after the rehearsal, putting away his equipment with military precision. "Tomorrow night will be a guaranteed technical success." Technical success. The words echoed in Eleanor's mind like an artistic death sentence. That night, she couldn't go home. She remained in the empty theater, sitting at the piano, trying to bring life to her original composition. But every time she played, she heard only correct notes without soul, a perfect execution that sounded like a distant echo of what the music should be. It was almost midnight when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Eleanor looked up, expecting to see the night watchman, but it was her mother, Ingrid Vance, who appeared in the doorway of the auditorium. "I thought I'd find you here," Ingrid said, walking slowly toward the stage. At 75, she still maintained the elegant posture she had passed on to her daughter, but her blue eyes carried a wisdom acquired through decades of quiet observation. "Mom, what are you doing here at this hour?" "Robert called me. He said you were going through a rough patch." Ingrid sat down next to her daughter on the piano bench. "Want to tell me what really happened?" Eleanor tried to maintain her composure, but her mother's gentle presence broke down the defenses she had built up throughout the day. The words came out in an emotional torrent. The board, Jules, the impossible choice between her career and something she barely understood. Ingrid listened in silence, her experienced hands gently caressing the piano keys without producing sound. "Do you remember why I started playing the piano?" Ingrid asked when Eleanor finished. "Sure. You always said it was to bring beauty into the world." "No," Ingrid smiled sadly. "I started playing to survive. When your father and I arrived in America, we had nothing. I gave piano lessons to rich kids to pay the rent. I played at weddings, parties, anywhere that paid. Music wasn't my passion, it was my prison." Eleanor looked at her mother in surprise. It was the first time she had heard this version of the story. "For years, I hated every note I played," Ingrid continued, "until the day I met your father. He was just a German watchmaker who had lost everything in the war. But when he heard me play, his eyes filled with tears. Not because I played perfectly, but because he could hear something I myself had forgotten existed." "What?" "My soul. He reminded me that music without soul is just organized noise." Ingrid looked directly into her daughter's eyes. "This man, Jules, he did the same thing for you, didn't he?" Eleanor felt tears burning in her eyes. "Yes, but now it's too late. I fired him. I chose my career, my reputation." "You chose fear," Ingrid corrected gently. "And I understand because I made the same choice many times. But let me tell you something I've never told you. 40 years ago, I had to choose between the security of a job as a teacher at a prestigious conservatory and the uncertainty of playing with your father in small clubs. I chose security. But you and Dad were happy together." "We were. But I always wondered what our music together would have been like. And when he passed, I realized I had wasted years being technically perfect instead of artistically true." Eleanor absorbed her mother's words, feeling as if a fundamental truth was being revealed. "Mom, what would you do in my place?" Ingrid got up and walked to the window, overlooking the street. "I can't answer that for you, dear, but I can tell you one thing. Tomorrow night, when you're on stage, you'll face a choice. You can play your composition the way you've always played it, perfect, controlled, safe, or you can play it the way you feel it should be played, regardless of what others may think. What if it goes wrong? What if I ruin my career? What if it goes right? What if you finally discover who you really are as an artist?" Ingrid returned to her daughter. Eleanor, you've spent your whole life trying to be the daughter you thought I wanted you to be. Disciplined, perfect, controlled, but you know what I've always wanted for you? What? That you be happy? That your music bring joy to you, not just to others. Mother and daughter were silent for a few minutes, the weight of the revelations hanging in the air between them. Is there a way to fix things with Jules? Eleanor asked finally. That's a question only you can answer, Ingrid said. But I can tell you where he is. Eleanor looked at her mother in surprise. Robert wasn't the only one who called me today. Jules also called. He wanted to say goodbye and thank you for everything. He said he'd be playing at the Blue Note downtown in case you wanted to talk. Eleanor's heart raced. He said that? Not exactly in those words, but after 45 years married to your father, I've learned to read between the lines. Ingrid smiled. Men in love rarely say directly what they feel. In love? Eleanor repeated, the words sounding strange in her voice. Honey, I saw the way you looked at each other. I saw the way you changed in the last few days. And I saw how he looked at you when he left today. Ingrid gently touched her daughter's face. Some encounters change our lives. The question is whether we have the courage to recognize it. Eleanor looked at the clock. 12:15. In less than 20 hours, she would be on stage, facing the most important performance of her career. But for the first time, she realized that the real question wasn't whether the performance would be a technical success. It was whether she would have the courage to be truly herself. Thank you, Mom, she said, hugging Ingrid tightly. For what? For reminding me of who I really am. The Blue Note was on a narrow street downtown, the kind of place Eleanor had never frequented in her adult life. The exposed brick walls, covered in posters of bands she didn't recognize, contrasted sharply with the refined environment she was used to. The smell of beer and cigarette smoke mixed with the aroma of fried snacks, creating an atmosphere that should have made her recoil, but that, strangely, reassured her. It was almost 1 a.m. when she finally mustered the courage to go in. On the small makeshift stage in the corner of the bar, Jules was playing guitar for an audience of maybe 20 people. His raspy voice carried a melancholic melody that Eleanor didn't recognize, but that seemed to tell the story of all the broken hearts in the world. She settled into a table in the back, hoping the dim lighting would hide her. But when the music ended and the few claps echoed through the room, Jules's eyes met hers through the smoke and the distance. The surprise on his face was quickly replaced by something she couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of joy and pain that made her question whether it had been a good idea to come there. Jules put away his guitar and walked to her table, moving with the same casual confidence he had shown at the theater, but with a sadness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I didn't expect to see you here, he said, pulling up a chair, especially on the eve of your big night. I didn't expect to be here, Eleanor admitted, nervously fiddling with the strap of her purse. But I needed to... Wanted to what? He asked gently without rushing her. Apologize. Explain. I don't know. The words came out rushed, loaded with a vulnerability that she rarely allowed others to see. What happened today wasn't my decision. Well, it was, but it wasn't what I wanted. Jules nodded to the bartender, ordering 2 beers without consulting her. Let me guess, the board of directors decided I wasn't suitable for the refined environment of the Philharmonic. Too much baggage, too many skeletons in the closet. They did a background check on you, Eleanor said, her voice low. They said things about your history, about our interaction, and you believed them. No, she protested, louder than she intended. I don't know, I was scared. Scared of what? The simple question hit the core of the problem. Eleanor looked around the bar at the ordinary people living their lives without the constant pressure of perfection and felt a knot form in her throat. Scared of losing everything I've worked for my whole life. Scared of not being the person everyone expects me to be. Scared of... She stopped, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. Scared of finding out that maybe I'm not really any good at what I do. Jules was silent for a moment, studying her face. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than she deserved. Eleanor, you are one of the most talented musicians I have ever met. Not just technically, although you are that too, but artistically. There is a passion in you that you've spent years trying to stifle. Then why do I feel like I'm falling apart? Because for the first time in your life, you're allowing that passion to breathe. And that's scary. The beers arrived, but neither of them touched their glass. The brutal honesty of the conversation created an intimacy that Eleanor had never experienced. Jules, I screwed everything up, she said finally. Not just with you, with my music, with my life. Tomorrow night I'm going to go up on that stage and play my composition in the same fearful and controlled way I always do. And it's going to be technically perfect and completely lifeless. Why does it have to be that way? Because that's what I know how to do. That's who I am. The frustration exploded in her voice. You don't understand. You can improvise, you can fail, you can try new things because you have nothing to lose. I have a reputation, responsibilities, the expectations of hundreds of people. And does that make you happy? The question hung in the air between them like an accusation. Eleanor realized she couldn't answer it. No, she whispered finally, but at least it's safe. Jules leaned forward, his voice growing more intense. Eleanor, you want to know what the difference is between us. It's not that I have nothing to lose. It's that I've discovered that living in fear of losing is worse than losing for real. Easy for you to say when you haven't built an entire career based on never failing. And hard for you to say when you've built an entire life based on never really living, he retorted. The comment stung more than any technical criticism she had ever received. Because it was true. So what do you want me to do? She asked, her voice breaking. Throw away everything I've worked for, ruin the most important performance of my career for a chance to... Of what? Of finding out that maybe I'm a fraud? I want you to stop being so afraid of being human. Jules reached across the table, gently touching her fingers. The contact was like an electric shock, awakening feelings she had buried so deeply that she had almost forgotten their existence. Eleanor, you are not a fraud. You are an extraordinary woman who has been taught to believe that perfection is more important than authenticity. But your music, when you really give yourself to it, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. The tears she had suppressed all night finally escaped, rolling silently down her cheeks. I don't know how to be different from what I've always been, she confessed. No one's asking you to be different. I'm asking you to be more yourself. Eleanor looked at Jules, at this man who had turned her life upside down in less than a week, and realized she was at the point of no return. She could go home, get a few hours of sleep, wake up tomorrow and give the safest and most technically perfect performance of her life. She could keep her reputation intact, her responsibilities fulfilled, her life perfectly controlled. Or she could jump into the abyss and discover who she really was when she stopped trying to be who others expected her to be. I'm terrified, she admitted. I know, Jules replied, gently squeezing her hand. But sometimes fear is the only thing that separates us from our true life. In that dingy, noisy bar, surrounded by people who lived without the suffocating pressure of perfection, Eleanor Vance faced the most terrifying truth of her life. Maybe it was time to stop living in fear of living. Eleanor woke up on Saturday with a mental clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The night at the bar had ended late, but she had slept deeply for the first time in weeks. She hadn't come to any definitive decision about what she would do at that night's performance. But something fundamental had changed within her. The fear was still there, but it was now accompanied by a growing determination that she barely recognized. She arrived at the theater at 9 in the morning, 3 hours before the dress rehearsal. The corridors were empty, creating a silence that seemed to carry the weight of all the decisions she needed to make. She went straight to the stage, where Paul Henderson was already working on his final adjustments. "Good morning, Maestro Vance," he said with his usual deference. "Everything's prepared for tonight. The sound is exactly within standard technical specifications. Eleanor watched the man working with mechanical precision, adjusting equipment according to manuals and protocols. He was competent, reliable, exactly the type of professional the board would approve of, and completely incapable of transforming sound into living music. "Paul, I'd like to make some adjustments," she said. "Of course, Maestro. What kind of adjustments?" Eleanor hesitated. She didn't have enough technical knowledge to explain what she wanted. She only knew how it should sound, not how to make it sound that way. "I want the sound to have more breath, more space between the notes." Paul looked at her with polite confusion. "I can decrease the compression if you prefer. That will give the audio more dynamics." "That's not it," she said, frustrated. "It's more organic, like the music has a life of its own." "I understand," Paul replied, clearly not understanding anything. "I'll make some adjustments, and you can tell me what you think." But Eleanor knew it wouldn't work. Paul was technically competent, but he didn't have the ear for what she was trying to achieve. Only Jules possessed that sensitivity, that ability to translate emotion into technical settings. During the afternoon dress rehearsal, her suspicions were confirmed. The orchestra played impeccably, each musician fulfilling their part with the expected precision. The sound was technically correct, balanced, professional, but it completely lacked the soul that had begun to emerge during the days working with Jules. When it came time for her original composition, Eleanor walked onto the stage with a heavy heart. She sat down at the piano and began to play, following exactly the notes she had made on the score. Every note came out perfect, every dynamic precisely executed. It was a masterful demonstration of pianistic technique, and it was completely empty. When she finished, the polite applause from the orchestra and the small audience of special guests echoed through the theater. She saw approval on faces, professional satisfaction, the certainty that the night would be an artistic and social success. But in the back of the auditorium, her mother watched her with an expression of understanding sadness that hurt more than any criticism. "Perfect, Maestro," declared Paul after the rehearsal. "Tonight will be a technical triumph." Eleanor nodded and smiled, but inside she felt as if she were preparing for her own artistic funeral. At 5 o'clock, she began to prepare for the performance. She put on the elegant black dress she always wore on formal occasions, pulled her hair back into the impeccable bun that had become her trademark, applied the subtle makeup that enhanced her features without calling undue attention. In the mirror, she saw the image of the respected conductor that the world expected to see. But behind the perfectly made-up blue eyes, a fierce battle was being fought. At 6:30, the guests began to arrive. Through the stage curtain, Eleanor watched the cultural and business elite of Illinois taking their seats. She recognized familiar faces, influential music critics, patrons of the arts, business leaders who funded cultural projects, politicians who supported artistic initiatives. In the main box, the members of the board of directors took their seats of honor, Arthur Sterling adjusting his tie with visible satisfaction. They had won. Order had been restored, respectability maintained, risks eliminated. At 7:15, with only 15 minutes to go before the start, Eleanor felt her phone vibrate. A text message from an unknown number. "Trust your music. Trust yourself. Jay." Her hands trembled as she read the words. Jules was there, somewhere. Maybe outside the theater, maybe watching through the online broadcast they always did of special performances. Somehow he knew that she needed to hear that. She put the phone away and walked to the stage for the final warm-up. The orchestra musicians greeted her with the usual respect, but she noticed something different in their eyes. They had known her for years. They knew how to recognize her emotional nuances, and they sensed that something important was about to happen. At 7:25, Robert Silver appeared on stage. 5 minutes, Maestro." Eleanor nodded but didn't move. She stood in the semi-darkness of the stage, listening to the murmurs of the expectant audience, feeling the weight of all the expectations she carried. For the first time in her adult life, she was about to step onto a stage without knowing exactly what she was going to do. She could follow the original plan, play her composition as she had rehearsed, maintain safety, preserve her reputation. It was the logical choice, the sensible choice. Or she could do something she had never done, completely trust her artistic intuition, regardless of the consequences. "Maestro," Robert called her softly, "it's time." Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs as if it were the first time. Through the curtain, she could see the stage lights waiting for her, the orchestra in position, the audience in silent expectation. She walked toward the stage, each step echoing like an irreversible decision. When the lights illuminated her and the applause began, she knew that the next few minutes would define not only her career, but who she really was as an artist and as a person. The final battle was about to begin, and this time she would fight for her soul. The applause ceased, and the theater plunged into expectant silence. Eleanor walked to the center of the stage, her steps echoing softly on the polished wooden floor. She stopped in front of the grand piano, her hands hovering over the familiar keys, and for a moment that seemed eternal, simply breathed. In the audience, hundreds of faces watched her. In the main box, the members of the board of directors awaited confirmation that they had made the right decision. Her mother, sitting in the third row, offered her an encouraging smile that carried decades of love and understanding. Eleanor closed her eyes and, for the first time in years, didn't think about technique, about expectations, or about reputation. She thought only about the music, not as a science to be mastered, but as a language to express everything she had kept inside herself for so long. When she began to play, her hands found the keys with a tenderness that surprised even her. The first notes of her composition emerged differently, slower, more contemplative, as if they were discovering their own existence. She wasn't following the meticulously annotated score, she was following her heart. The melody that flowed from her fingers told a story she had never allowed to be heard. It was the story of a girl who loved music more than anything in the world, who had grown up believing that perfection was synonymous with love, who had built a golden cage around her own passion. As the music unfolded, Eleanor felt something extraordinary happen. The musicians of the orchestra, who knew each of her artistic mannerisms, began to respond not to what was written on their scores, but to what they felt flowing from her. The concertmaster abandoned his technical notes and followed the emotion of the melody. The brass found a tenderness they had never explored. The timpani whispered instead of announced. In the sound booth, Paul Henderson stared confusedly at his equipment. The sound being produced didn't correspond to any of his technical settings, but somehow it sounded perfect. It was as if the music itself was finding its way through the speakers, regardless of electronic adjustments. The audience, initially rigid in their formal expectations, began to relax. Eleanor could feel the change in the energy of the room. People stopping to check their phones, critics putting down their pens, the collective attention focusing not on judgment, but on the pure experience of being touched by the music. When it came time for the climax of her composition, Eleanor did something she had never done in public. She improvised. Her hands found notes that weren't on the original score, created passages that were born directly from her soul. It was risky, unpredictable, completely out of control. It was absolutely perfect. The music reached a crescendo that wasn't technically virtuosic, but emotionally devastating. Eleanor felt tears roll down her face as she played, not from sadness, but from a release that had waited decades to happen. She was finally allowing her true artistic voice to be heard. When the last notes faded into the silence of the theater, no one moved. For long seconds, 400 people remained still, processing what they had just experienced. Then from the back of the auditorium began an applause unlike any Eleanor had ever received. It wasn't the polite applause of technical approval, but the emotional explosion of genuinely touched people. The audience rose as a wave, the applause growing in intensity and warmth. Eleanor saw tears in the eyes of seasoned critics, emotional smiles on faces that normally maintained professional composure. Her mother cried openly, proud not of her daughter's impeccable technique, but of the courage she had shown. In the main box, the members of the board of directors seemed bewildered. This wasn't what they had planned. It didn't follow the protocols they knew, but even they couldn't deny the impact of what they had witnessed. When the applause finally subsided, Eleanor approached the microphone. Her voice, normally controlled and formal, came out soft and authentic. "I want to thank all of you for allowing me to share not only my music, but my truth. And I want to especially thank someone who taught me that perfect music is not that executed without errors, but that played without fear." She searched the audience, although she knew that Jules probably wasn't there. But her words flew through the live streams, through the social networks, where people were already beginning to share videos of the performance, until they found who needed to hear them. In the week that followed, something extraordinary happened. Videos of Eleanor's performance spread across the internet, not through the elitist circles of classical music, but among ordinary people who were touched by the raw humanity of her music. Critics from major outlets wrote reviews that spoke not only of technique, but of artistic soul. The board of directors, facing an overwhelmingly positive public reaction, quietly abandoned any idea of censoring Eleanor. In fact, they discovered that the humanization of their star maestro had made the orchestra more accessible and popular than ever. 2 months later, Eleanor found Jules again. This time, it was she who sought him out, appearing at the bar where he played with a violin in her hands. "I thought maybe we could make music together," she said, a shy but genuine smile illuminating her face. "I mean, if you don't mind a maestro who's still learning to improvise." Jules smiled back, the same smile that had awakened something in her weeks ago. "I love teaching rookies." They played together that night, her classical technique intertwining with his spontaneous creativity, creating something that neither of them could have achieved alone. It was imperfect, experimental, completely outside the standards she knew. It was the most beautiful music she had ever made. 6 months later, Eleanor Vance and Jules Moretti were not only making music together, but building a life together. She had learned that love, like music, flourishes best when allowed to be imperfect. He had discovered that structure, when combined with passion, can create something even more powerful than pure improvisation. And together, they discovered that the most beautiful harmonies are born when two different souls decide to create something greater than the sum of their individual parts. Dear listeners, we hope that Eleanor's journey has touched you deeply, reminding us that true perfection lies in embracing our humanity. To continue exploring stories that celebrate the courage to be authentic, we've prepared a special playlist with equally moving narratives about love, music, and self-discovery. Find that selection by clicking to your left. If the story of Eleanor and Jules resonated in your hearts, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the complex beauty of the human experience, reminding us that sometimes you have to break the rules of perfection to find the true harmony of life. Don't miss our upcoming content and share in the comments your own stories of courage and transformation. We look forward to seeing you.